When people hear US-Iran escalation, the first images that usually come to mind are missiles, airstrikes, military briefings, and breaking news banners. But if you really want to understand why this crisis matters, you have to look beyond the battlefield and focus on something narrower, quieter, and in many ways even more important: the Strait of Hormuz. Because this is not only a military story, it is an energy story, a shipping story, an insurance story, an inflation story, and a global economic story. And that is exactly why so many governments, markets, and companies are watching it so closely right now. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most critical choke points in the global economy. According to the International Energy Agency, an average of about 20 million barrels per day of crude oil and oil products moved through it in 2025. The U.S. Energy Information Administration says flows through the strait in 2024 and early 2025 accounted for more than a quarter of global seaborne oil trade and about 1/5 of global oil and petroleum product consumption. It also carried around 1/5 of global LNG trade, much of it from Qatar. At its narrowest point, the strait is only 29 nautical miles wide, and the navigable inbound and outbound channels are about 2 miles wide each. That means a very large amount of the world's energy moves through a very small space. That basic fact explains why a crisis in this one corridor can ripple far beyond the Middle East. When a place this important becomes dangerous, shipping slows, insurers get nervous, prices jump, and governments start looking for emergency tools. In a stable period, most people never think about the Strait of Hormuz at all. That is because stable systems are supposed to feel boring. Tankers move. Insurance gets written. Cargo arrives. Refineries plan around expected delivery. Utilities trust their supply chain. The whole system depends on the route staying open, predictable, and commercially usable. Once that predictability starts breaking down, the effects move outward very quickly. That is what makes the current crisis so serious. Recent reporting describes a situation where traffic through the strait dropped sharply after the conflict intensified. NPR described an effective closure, driven not by a classic old-style blockade, but by a combination of attacks, threats, and fear that led insurers and shipping companies to pull back. The Guardian reported that seaborne traffic had dropped by about 80% at one point, and that at least 4 tankers had been struck by drones. The point here is not that every ship stopped forever. The point is that normal commercial behavior stopped looking normal. And once that happens at a choke point this important, the whole energy system starts to feel the strain. That distinction matters because most people still imagine a maritime shutdown in old-fashioned terms. They picture naval fleets facing off, mines physically closing the passage, or a formal blockade in the textbook sense. But the reporting around this crisis points to something more modern and, in a way, more destabilizing. The route did not need to be fully sealed by force to become commercially unusable. It only had to become risky enough that the people who run the shipping system decided it was no longer worth the exposure. That is why one expert quoted by NPR described the situation as an insurance-driven shutdown. In other words, military pressure started the problem, but commercial risk completed it. That tells you something important about how power works in 2026. It is not just about who can dominate a map militarily. It is also about who can change behavior across the market. A state or armed actor does not necessarily need to destroy every tanker or win a classic naval confrontation to choke a route like Hormuz. It may only need to make the risk too expensive, too uncertain, or too dangerous for insurers, operators, and crews to accept. In that kind of contest, the target is not only the ship. The target is the decision to sail. This is why the Strait of Hormuz matters to people far from the Gulf. The first visible effect is usually price. NPR reported that global crude prices rose more than 10% after the US and Israel attacked Iran, while natural gas prices in Europe and Asia rose even more sharply. The Guardian reported Brent rising 15% to about $83 a barrel in the early phase of the crisis, and later coverage described prices hitting as high as $119 before easing again on hopes that the conflict might de-escalate. AP reported that oil climbed from under $70 before the war to nearly $120 at one point, then settled back near $90. Those are not small swings. They reflect a market trying to price not only current disruption, but the possibility that one of the world's central energy routes may remain impaired. But price is only the first layer. The deeper issue is uncertainty. Energy markets are built around constant movement and planning. Refiners need expected cargoes. Importers need reliable schedules. Utilities need supply confidence. Traders need a functioning insurance market. Governments need to know whether they should release reserves, encourage rerouting, or prepare for further inflation pressure. Once uncertainty enters at scale, markets do not just react to what has already happened. They react to what might happen next, and that can be just as powerful. This is also why the current crisis cannot be understood as a shipping issue alone. Recent reporting says nearby energy infrastructure has also been affected. NPR noted attacks striking oil and gas infrastructure in neighboring countries. raising questions about whether alternate export routes are as usable in practice as they look on paper. The Guardian reported damage and shutdowns affecting places like Saudi Arabia's Ras Tanura, Qatar's LNG operations, and the UAE's Fujairah port area. Once infrastructure risk enters the picture, the problem becomes larger than just whether ships can pass through one narrow waterway. It becomes a question of whether the broader Gulf export system can operate with enough confidence to keep energy flowing. That is one reason analysts have reached for comparisons to the oil shocks of the 1970s. They are not saying history is repeating in exactly the same way. They are saying this is one of the rare situations where a single regional military crisis can stress oil, gas, shipping, insurance, and global market psychology all at once. NPR quoted experts saying this looks like the biggest energy crisis since that era. That is a serious comparison, and it reflects how central Hormuz is to the system. Now, a natural question many viewers will have is this: if the United States has such enormous military capability in the region, why can't it just solve the problem quickly? The answer is that there is a difference between military access and commercial normalcy. A navy can patrol a route, it can escort ships, it can suppress some threats, it can signal deterrence. But that does not automatically restore insurance coverage, crew confidence, and the willingness of shipping companies to operate as if this were just another business week. NPR reported that President Trump said the United States would provide naval escorts for tankers and that the U.S. Development Finance Corporation would offer reasonably priced political risk insurance for shipping lines operating in the Gulf. That response itself tells you that Washington sees this as more than a purely military problem. It is also a financial and commercial problem. But experts quoted in that same reporting were skeptical that escorts and government-backed insurance would be enough to restore large-scale traffic quickly. One concern is legal and financial limits on what the DFC can realistically provide. Another is much simpler. Even if insurance becomes available, many ship owners may still decide the voyage is not worth the risk to seafarers, vessels, cargoes, and the environment. In a narrow waterway, one successful hit can have outsized consequences. So the challenge is not just reopening the route on paper. The challenge is making it believable again. That idea of credibility is central to the entire story. For a shipping lane to function normally, the market has to believe tomorrow's voyage will look more like routine commerce than like a war headline. If that belief is missing, then even a technically open route can still be commercially paralyzed. That is why this crisis says something larger about the modern world. Trade does not run only on hardware. It runs on trust. Trust that the passage is safe enough, trust that the insurer will stand behind the voyage, trust that the next incident will not turn one voyage into a catastrophic loss. Once that trust breaks, the system slows before formal supply outages even show up in full. This is also why the fallout from Hormuz does not fall equally on every country. Exposure varies. The Guardian cited popular data showing that while countries in the Americas import a relatively modest share of oil via the Strait, China's dependence is much higher. The International Energy Agency's Hormuz fact sheet says about 80% of the oil moving through the strait is destined for Asia. That means the same disruption lands very differently depending on where you are. For some countries, it is mainly a price shock. For others, it is a much more direct supply vulnerability. That uneven exposure affects diplomacy, policy, and market pressure. Countries with greater dependence on Gulf energy have stronger incentives to support de-escalation, emergency reserve use, or rapid commercial stabilization. Companies with business concentrated in the region face different decisions than firms with more diversified sourcing. Financial markets in import-heavy regions may watch Hormuz with greater urgency than exporters do. In other words, the Strait of Hormuz is not just a route on a map, it is also a map of dependency. This is where the phrase oil shock becomes more meaningful than just a spike on a chart. An oil shock is not only about the headline number for Brent crude, it is about what that move starts doing to the rest of the system. Higher oil prices can feed into gasoline prices, diesel prices, freight costs, fertilizer costs, airline costs, and inflation pressure more broadly. AP reported that the conflict has already raised gasoline and fertilizer prices and created fresh risks for inflation and food insecurity, especially in more vulnerable economies. That is the kind of spillover that turns a regional military confrontation into a global economic problem. And it is not only oil. LNG matters too. The US EIA says around 1/5 of global LNG trade went through Hormuz in 2024, largely from Qatar. That matters because LNG is not just a fuel in one region. It is deeply tied into energy security for countries in Europe and Asia. When gas markets are already tight or dependent on imported cargoes, a disruption in the Gulf can push prices higher and make buyers more nervous very quickly. NPR specifically reported that natural gas prices in Europe and Asia rose more sharply than oil prices in the initial phase of the crisis. This is why some producers and governments are scrambling to reroute what they can. The Guardian reported that Saudi Aramco said it aimed to restore over 70% of its crude shipments within days by routing about 5 million barrels per day through its east-west pipeline to Yanbu on the Red Sea. That is an important buffer. It shows there are alternatives in the system. But it also shows their limits. If roughly 20 million barrels per day normally move through Hormuz, rerouting 5 million still leaves a huge exposure. Buffers reduce the pain. They do not erase the choke point. That is one of the most important things to get right if you want a YouTube-safe, reality-based script. A serious disruption is not the same thing as immediate total collapse. There are stockpiles. There are alternate routes for some exporters. There are policy tools like emergency reserve releases. There are diplomatic off-ramps. But there is no simple substitute for a corridor that normally handles this much oil and LNG. The right framing is not panic. It is seriousness. And the seriousness is visible in how governments are responding. The Guardian reported today that G7 leaders urged the International Energy Agency to prepare for possible emergency reserve releases, although no formal decision had yet been made. It also reported that Saudi Aramco warned of potentially catastrophic consequences if the strait remains blocked, even as it tried to reassure markets that some exports could be rerouted. That tells you policymakers and producers are trying to walk a careful line. They want to avoid panic, but they are clearly treating the situation as a major systemic risk. The wider conflict itself also matters here. AP reported today that the war had entered a new phase, with more intense U.S. strikes, Iran vowing to fight on, and regional fallout already including civilian casualties, displacement, and injuries to U.S. personnel. AP separately reported that about 140 U.S. troops had been injured so far, with 8 severely. Those figures matter not because they directly determine oil prices, but because they show the confrontation is not a one-day shock. It is an ongoing regional crisis. And the longer a crisis lasts, the harder it becomes for markets to assume a quick return to normal. This is where the phrase "what comes next" becomes the most important part of your title. Because the real question now is not only what has happened, it is how this evolves. One possibility is partial stabilization. Escorts expand, insurance mechanisms help somewhat, rerouted exports relieve some pressure, and markets gradually regain enough confidence that a portion of normal traffic returns. In that scenario, prices may stay elevated and volatility may remain high, but the system avoids the most severe form of prolonged disruption. Reporting today suggests markets have already shown some sensitivity to any sign of de-escalation, with oil prices falling back from their highs when hopes of stabilization rose. Another possibility is a longer period of impaired confidence. That could mean some traffic returns, but not enough to normalize the route. Some insurance comes back, but not enough to restore routine operations. And some exports are rerouted, but not enough to offset the loss of the choke point. In that world, the global fallout would continue through volatility, higher costs, tighter supply, and greater political pressure on governments that depend heavily on Gulf energy. The Guardian's reporting today about continuing coordination among European governments on commercial shipping suggests leaders are taking that possibility seriously. And then there is the higher risk scenario. The strait remains badly impaired for longer. Surrounding infrastructure stays under pressure. Producers face storage constraints. And governments move closer to emergency reserve deployment. AP has already reported that the war is delivering another shock to the global economy, particularly for low-income and energy-importing countries. NPR also noted that Iraq had to shut down production in some of its largest oil fields because if it cannot export through Hormuz, it cannot keep producing indefinitely with nowhere to put the oil. That is the kind of second-order effect that turns a transport disruption into a deeper supply problem. That last point is especially important because it shows how choke point crises cascade. The first problem is usually transit. But if transit stays blocked long enough, then storage fills, production slows, export planning breaks down, and the damage outlasts the original disruption. That is why a prolonged Hormuz crisis can become much more than a temporary shipping scare. It can begin reshaping production decisions, trade flows, and inflation expectations well beyond the Gulf. This is also a reminder of how modern systems fail. They do not always fail through one dramatic, apocalyptic event. Sometimes they fail through a series of smaller changes that accumulate. A strike near the route, an insurer pulling back, another ship canceling transit, more risk premium, delayed cargoes, tighter inventories, and a market that starts assuming tomorrow will be less stable than today. None of those steps alone is the collapse. But together, they can create a very serious shutdown effect. That is exactly why Hormuz matters so much. So if you want the cleanest, safest, and most accurate takeaway from this whole crisis, it is this. The Strait of Hormuz matters because it sits at the point where military escalation becomes global economic pressure. It is where a regional war starts reaching into energy bills, shipping markets, inflation risk, and government decision-making far outside the Middle East. It is where the gap between military power and commercial confidence becomes impossible to ignore. And it is where the world is being reminded that a huge part of modern stability still depends on a few narrow places staying open, trusted, and boring. Right now, Hormuz is none of those things. It is not boring, it is not fully trusted, and it is not functioning normally. That is why this crisis matters, and that is why the global fallout is real. Not because every worst-case claim online is true, not because one viral headline can explain everything, but because one of the world's key energy arteries has been thrown into severe disruption, and the system around it is still trying to decide whether it believes normal movement can return. And until that belief comes back, the Strait of Hormuz will remain one of the clearest indicators of where this crisis goes next. Because in a connected world, the most important place in a conflict is often not the largest battlefield. It is the bottleneck.